They told JD Vance to leave, fully expecting him to react with anger. His reply left the entire diner in stunned silence. JD Vance parked his car outside Owen's Diner, a humble establishment located in the heart of Springfield, Ohio. This was the kind of place that had stood the test of time, its neon sign flickering just slightly, and the smell of burgers and fresh coffee greeting anyone who stepped through the door. A local had recommended it to him earlier that day, raving about their homemade meatloaf and freshly cut fries. Exhausted from a day full of meetings and discussions, all JD wanted was a quiet meal before the long drive back. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. The diner was small, but cozy at first glance. It was the type of place where the regulars sat in the same booths every evening, and the walls were lined with faded Polaroids showing decades of customers and staff. The familiar smells of bacon, grease, and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, blending with the soft murmur of conversation. JD's eyes met the hostess behind the counter. She was smiling as he walked in, but the moment she recognized him, that smile faltered. It was almost imperceptible, a brief hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty, as though she wasn't sure how to proceed. She pressed her lips into a thin line. JD scanned the room. A few heads turned in his direction, and a man, midway through his burger, leaned in to whisper something to his companion. Nearby, a woman in a flannel shirt set her coffee cup down with a little too much force, narrowing her eyes before quickly looking away. JD wasn't blind to the tension. He could feel the unease in the room. But here, in a diner like this? The hostess hesitated once more, then stepped forward, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Good evening," she said, her voice careful. "Are you dining in or taking out?" JD let out a small chuckle, weary from the day. "Dining in, if that's all right." Another pause, too long for a simple question. She glanced toward the kitchen, then back at him. "I need to check something. Real quick, just one moment." She vanished through the swinging door, leaving JD standing in the middle of the room. A few more people looked his way. A man at the counter shifted in his seat, muttering something under his breath. Something wasn't right. The silence stretched on, the seconds dragging out behind the kitchen door. Muffled voices came from within, too distant to be made out. JD exhaled slowly and straightened his shoulders. He wasn't here to cause trouble. Maybe there was a policy, maybe they were short-staffed. The hostess returned, her demeanor now different. No longer unsure, she was resolute. "I'm sorry, sir," she said firmly. "We can't serve you tonight." The way she said it, the atmosphere in the room shifting with her words, made it clear this wasn't a business decision. It was personal. For a brief moment, JD remained silent. The words hung heavy in the air between them, like something that didn't need further explanation. The hum of conversation had ceased. The sizzle of the grill in the back continued, but the usual chatter had quieted. People were watching, waiting. JD studied the hostess. Her face wasn't hostile, just firm, like she had made up her mind, or maybe someone else had made it up for her. His gaze flicked over her shoulder toward the kitchen window, where two cooks stood half-hidden behind a heat lamp, their expressions unreadable. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry. Did I do something wrong?" This time, the hostess didn't fidget. "It's just, we'd rather not serve you tonight." "No policy?" "No. We're closing soon." Just that. JD let out a breath, his hands settling on his hips. He had dealt with plenty of uncomfortable situations before, but being turned away from a simple diner like this felt different. A cough broke the silence. JD turned slightly, catching the eye of an older man sitting near the counter. The man shook his head more to himself than anyone else before continuing to stab at his plate of eggs. A few booths away, a woman shifted uncomfortably, her expression unreadable. Across from her, a younger man, probably in his 30s, leaned back with his arms crossed, clearly enjoying the tension. JD took it all in, the eyes that averted his gaze, the ones that lingered too long, and the ones that seemed almost satisfied. The weight of the moment pressed on him. He had choices. He could leave, let it go. He could call them out, threaten to turn this into a media storm. He could demand an explanation, challenge them for refusing a U.S. senator. Instead, he did none of that. "All right," he said, nodding slowly, his voice calm. "Can I speak with the manager?" The request caught a few people off guard. The hostess hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen, looking for some unspoken approval. The older man at the counter muttered something under his breath, and someone near the window let out a short laugh, disbelief in their voice. JD simply stood there, waiting. The hostess disappeared again, this time through a different door. A few beats of silence passed. Coffee was sipped, plates were moved around. Then the door opened. A man in his early 50s stepped out, broad-shouldered, and wearing a grease-stained apron. His name tag read Don. Don didn't ask what JD needed. He just sized him up with a look, then said, "I hear you've got a question." But the tone wasn't welcoming. It wasn't polite. It was a challenge. JD met his gaze, unwavering. He wasn't here to argue, but he wasn't walking away without understanding the reason for this treatment either. "Yeah," JD said. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Don exhaled through his nose like he was expecting this but still didn't want to deal with it. He wiped his hands on his apron, glancing over at the few remaining customers, all of whom were pretending not to listen yet clearly listening. "Look," Don said, shifting his weight. "This ain't personal." JD raised an eyebrow. "Seems pretty personal." Don's jaw tightened. He rubbed the back of his neck, then sighed. "People around here got their opinions about you. About the things you stand for. I've got a business to run and I don't want trouble." JD nodded slowly. "And me sitting down for a meal is trouble?" Don didn't answer right away. He glanced at the counter where the old man was slowly chewing his eggs. A few booths away, the younger man still had his arms crossed, watching this unfold like it was the best show of the week. JD had seen this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. It wasn't about one decision, it was about the larger implications. It was about how people would react, the expectations that would shape choices, even when they weren't entirely sure they agreed. He glanced back at Don. "Be honest with me. Do you agree with this? Or is this just about keeping the peace?" Don hesitated, his fingers tapping against the back of the chair. For a moment, JD saw something like discomfort in Don's face, a crack in his resolve. Before Don could respond, the younger guy in the booth spoke up. "Oh, come on," he scoffed. "This isn't about politics, man. It's about people knowing who you really are." JD turned to face him, meeting his gaze. "And who am I?" The guy grinned, finally feeling like he'd gotten the attention he wanted. "You're the guy who acts like he understands the regular people, but you play politics just like everyone else." JD nodded slowly, taking that in. "All right," he said. "Then tell me, what do you think I should have done differently?" The guy blinked, clearly thrown off by the unexpected response. "You want me gone? Fine," JD continued. "But now you've got the floor. Say what you need to say." The diner was dead silent now, no clinking of forks, no plates being moved. Even the kitchen had gone quiet. Don sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "This ain't what I expected." Tonight, JD cracked a small, tired smile. "Me neither." But for the first time, the tension wasn't just about division, it was about something else, something close to understanding. The air in the diner had shifted. People who had pretended not to care were now watching, listening. Even the younger man who had been so quick to criticize now seemed hesitant. JD sat still, patient. The younger guy in the booth seemed like he was about to say something, but then paused. Maybe he realized JD wasn't defending himself, wasn't fighting back. JD was just waiting. Don, still gripping the chair, let out a long breath. "You want to know what people think?" Don finally asked. "They think you're full of it." JD didn't react. He just tilted his head slightly as if considering the words. "They think you talk about working-class folks," Don continued, "but you still play the game. You make promises like every other guy in a suit, but when it comes down to it, nothing ever changes." Don exhaled sharply. "And they don't forget." JD nodded slowly. "I get that." The younger guy scoffed. "That's all you're gonna say?" JD turned toward him. "What else do you want me to say?" The guy straightened up, arms uncrossed. I don't know, man. You're supposed to argue. Defend yourself. JD leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. You already made up your mind about me before I walked in. You wanted me to get mad. You wanted me to fight back so you could feel justified. The younger guy's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. JD's voice was steady as he continued. But what if I told you I know exactly what that frustration feels like? He looked back at Don. You said nothing changes. I know that feeling. I grew up in it. I watched people around me get left behind. Hell, I felt left behind. And yeah, I went to school, did things people didn't expect me to do, but that doesn't mean I forgot. Don tapped his fingers on the chair, his face unreadable. But JD didn't see dismissiveness anymore. He saw thoughtfulness. JD glanced around the room. You don't have to agree with me. I'm not here to change your minds, but I walked in here as a customer, not a politician, just a guy looking for a meal. A pause. From the counter, the old man in the work jacket muttered, Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger. The ray. Tension cracked just slightly. A few people smirked. Even Don let out a small chuckle. JD turned back to Don. So what now? Don exhaled and rubbed his face. He looked toward the kitchen where the cooks were still watching, then back at JD. I'll tell you what, Don said. You stay here and finish this conversation, and if by the end of it, I don't think you're just another guy talking. A good game, maybe. Just maybe. I'll have my waitress bring you a menu. JD nodded. A small smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Sounds like a deal. For the first time that night, the room didn't feel divided. It felt like something else. Something closer to a conversation. The air had changed. Don's shoulders had relaxed slightly. The younger guy in the booth had lost his smirk and was sitting up now, no longer leaning back like this was a show. Even the people who had been watching, keeping their judgments to themselves, seemed less certain. JD leaned forward, voice calm. All right, let's finish this conversation. Don dropped into the seat across from him, looking tired in a way that wasn't from a long shift. He looked like someone who'd been carrying the weight of the world for too long. I'll be honest, Don said, rubbing his hands together. I don't know if you're the guy people think you are. I don't know if you're really looking out for folks like us, or if you just know how to talk a good game. JD nodded, accepting that. What I do know, Don continued, is that around here people've got long memories. They remember every promise, every time someone shook their hand and said they'd do something, only to walk away and never come back. JD tapped a knuckle against the table, thinking. I don't blame them for that, he said softly. Don let out a laugh, shaking his head. That's the problem. Nobody ever does. A beat passed. Then the old man at the counter spoke up again. I worked 35 years in a factory. 35 damn years. He set his coffee cup down with a soft thud. I watched my neighbors lose their jobs. I watched whole families pack up and leave because there was nothing left for them. Watched politicians show up, shake a few hands, tell us they understood, then drive back to wherever the hell they came from. JD met his eyes. And do you think I'm one of those politicians? The old man stared at him for a long time, then shrugged. I don't know, but I'll tell you one thing, he said, pointing a calloused finger at him. You're the only one who stuck around to listen. That hit hard. The waitress behind the counter glanced at Don. The cooks exchanged looks. Even the younger guy in the booth, once so vocal, had nothing to say. JD let the silence settle, then turned back to Don. So, what's it gonna be? Don tapped his fingers on the table, glanced at the kitchen, then stood up. Mary, he called toward the counter. Get him a menu. A ripple of surprise passed through the diner. The younger guy scoffed but didn't argue. The waitress, Mary, hesitated for just a second, then grabbed a laminated menu and walked it over. JD took it with a small nod. Appreciate it. Don shook his head, half amused and half in disbelief. I still don't know if I like you. JD smiled, flipping open the menu. That's all right. I don't need everyone to like me. Don laughed short and loud. Then he turned toward the kitchen. "All right, boys, fire up the grill." And just like that, what started as rejection turned into something no one in that diner would forget. The tension didn't fade completely, but enough. Enough for forks to start clinking again. Enough for conversations to slowly rebuild. JD sat at the booth, the menu in hand but not reading it. He was watching Don, watching the old man at the counter, watching the younger guy in the booth who still looked skeptical but no longer smirking. Mary poured him another cup of coffee. He nodded a thanks. She hesitated, then muttered, "We make it strong here." JD took a sip and raised an eyebrow. "I can tell." A few chuckles rippled through the diner. Don was still standing by the kitchen watching JD with arms crossed. Finally, he walked back over. "All right," Don said, dropping into the seat across from JD again. "Since you're here, tell me something." JD set the menu down. "What's that?" Don tilted his head. "You ever had this happen before?" JD thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Not like this." Don nodded slowly, then asked, "You stayed. Most guys in your position would have walked out by now." JD leaned back, taking another sip of coffee. "Maybe." Don let out a chuckle. "Made a fuss, called a lawyer, maybe plastered this place all over the news by morning." JD smirked. "Thought about it." Don laughed harder, then sobered quickly. "You're not going to change everyone's mind." JD nodded. "I know." Don sighed, rubbing his neck again. "And I can't promise I won't regret serving you tomorrow." JD grinned. "That's fair." The old man at the counter, still not looking up, muttered again, "Still a damn shame when a man can't get a burger." JD turned toward him. "Well, I think that's about to change." Mary appeared shortly after, setting a plate down in front of him, a classic diner cheeseburger, hand-cut fries on the side. Simple, but perfect. JD picked up the burger, took a bite, and then with a straight face said, "Little dry." For half a second, the diner went dead still. Then Don barked out a laugh, the first real laugh of the night. A few others joined in. Even Mary shook her head. JD set the burger down and wiped his hands on a napkin. "Kidding, it's good." Don shook his head, still smirking. "You're a piece of work." JD nodded. "I've been told." The younger guy in the booth didn't say anything, but something had changed in his expression. He wasn't fully convinced, but he wasn't dismissing JD either. As JD finished his meal, the diner started feeling like itself again. Conversations picked back up, plates clattered, and coffee was refilled. People still had their doubts, but for one night, in one small town, a different kind of conversation had taken place. Maybe that was enough. Because in a time when everyone is ready to shout, sometimes the real power is in staying, listening, and proving even for just a moment that not everything has to be a fight.